We are pleased and honored to bring to you today Professor Irwin Cotler, the Canadian Special Envoy on Antisemitism and the founder and chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. Irwin Cotler doesn't just speak, he acts. In every respect, he works to battle anti-Semitism, he works to battle anti-Zionism, and he works against Holocaust distortion, Holocaust denial, and he works against the demonization of Israel, Zionism, and the Jewish people. Please welcome my dear friend, Irwin Cotler.
כבוד גדול בשבילי להשתתף באירוע משמעותי הזו. I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem, and I began in Hebrew because that is the indigenous language of the indigenous Jewish people. And before I actually go into my remarks, I want to express my appreciation to Richard Heidemann for his warm remarks, but in particular for his exemplary leadership these past 4 years, not only with respect to the American Zionist movement, but indeed his leadership both domestically and internationally in all things good. In my remarks today, and as I mentioned, I began in Hebrew because that's the indigenous language of the Jewish people, and Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, the embodiment of that indigeneity. I'd like to make 4 brief points. The first is that the Jewish people is a prototypical indigenous people, a people that still inhabits the same land, embraces the same religion, studies the same indigenous Torah, hearkens to the same indigenous prophets, speaks the same indigenous language, Hebrew, and bears the same indigenous name, Israel, as we did 3,500 years ago. And that is why I say that the Jewish people is a prototypical indigenous people, and Zionism is a manifestation of that indigeneity and the embodiment of Jewish identity in its indigeneity. Which brings me to the second point, one not always appreciated, and that is that the Jewish people is not only a prototypical indigenous people, but it is a prototypical anti-colonialist people and movement, which has been struggling from time immemorial against all colonial attempts at dispossession and displacement, at dispersion and even destruction. We are reminded not only of the destruction of the 2 temples in Jerusalem, but the history of attempted dispossession, dispersal, displacement, and destruction. Whether we speak of the horrors of the Inquisition, the Crusades, or the hole on the road of persecutions and pogroms which preceded and paved the way for the Holocaust, which, as Elie Wiesel reminded us so importantly and so significantly, that the Holocaust was a war against the Jews in which not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were targeted victims, which makes the indictment of Israel as a colonial state and Zionism as a colonial movement one of turning both facts, law, and history on its head. And I did not even reference the colonialist assaults on the nascent Jewish state in the wars of aggression beginning in 47 and 48 and continuing thereafter. Which brings me to the third point, that we are witnessing an old, new, global, escalating sophisticated, virulent, and even lethal anti-Semitism, grounded in classical anti-Semitism, but distinguishable from it, which found its first institutional and international juridical expression in the Zionism is racism resolution, but has gone dramatically beyond that. A new anti-Semitism for which we almost need a new vocabulary to define it, but which can best be understood using a human rights lens in general and an equality rights lens and anti-discrimination approach in particular, which underpins also the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. Simply put, traditional or classical anti-Semitism is a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the rights of Jews to live as equal members in whatever society they inhabit. The new anti-Semitism is a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the rights of Israel and the Jewish people to live as an equal member of the family of nations, of the rights even to live, and the emergence of Israel as the collective, targeted Jew among the nations, which finds expression today, and I hope you'll indulge me in using a series of one-liners with respect to this new anti-Semitism, but for reasons of time and as an informed audience, I'll do it that way, which finds expression today in what might be called genocidal anti-Semitism, the toxic convergence of the advocacy of the most horrific of crimes, namely genocide, embedded in the most toxic of hatreds, namely anti-Semitism, and finding expression, for example, in this standing incitement to hatred and genocide as represented in Khamenei's Iran. And we need to be reminded also that the very incitement to genocide constitutes the crime, whether or not the atrocities follow. And so this standing incitement to hatred is itself an international crime, which we have to combat as those who care about the pursuit of international justice. And then we have what I would call demonological anti-Semitism. That is the portrayal of Israel and the Jewish people as the enemy of all that is good and the embodiment of all that is evil. And so it is then that Israel is portrayed not only as a colonialist, but an imperialist, ethnic cleansing, child killing, racist, apartheid, Nazi state. And I'm using only some of the daily indictments that find expression in this demonological anti-Semitism, and where Zionism is inextricably bound up with this international indictment, which leads me to the third manifestation of this new anti-Semitism, which I would call political anti-Semitism, the denial of Israel's right to exist, let alone also the denial of its legitimacy, the denial of the Jewish people's right to self-determination, if not also the denial of the Jews as a people, let alone even the indigeneity to which I was referencing. The whole, in effect, a denial of Jewish peoplehood in any form or manifestation, and sometimes and crudely under the cover of anti-Zionism, which leads me to the fourth and final dimension of this new anti-Semitism, and perhaps the most dangerous because it is the most sophisticated. And here I'm speaking about the laundering, the masking of anti-Semitism, of the delegitimization of Israel and the Jewish people under universal public values, under the protective cover of the United Nations, under the authority of international law, under the culture of human rights, and worse than I referenced it briefly, under the struggle against racism. Let's face it, the worst thing that you can do in the world today is to call somebody a racist or to call a people and a state racist. The very label supplies the indictment. No further proof is required. And if any further proof is required, then one continuously trots out the label of Israel as an apartheid state. Let there be no mistake about it. Apartheid is defined in international law as a crime against humanity. If you say that Israel is an apartheid state, what you are saying is that Israel is a crime against humanity. If it is a crime against humanity, then it has no right to be. And if that is not enough, you refer to Israel as a Nazi state. So not only does it have no right to be, but there is an obligation to dismantle it. And hence the importance here of the IRA definition in calling out this particular laundering of anti-Semitism under the cover of anti-racism, which is now extended to the referencing at times of the Jewish people as part of the white supremacist group, thereby, in effect, seeking to preclude the Jewish people of even having standing to enter the debate, of even having standing to join the conversation and to join the struggle against all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism. Let me also make it clear. None of this is intended to suggest that somehow Israel and the Jewish people are above the law, or that Israel and the Jewish people deserve any particular preference because of the Holocaust or the horrors of Jewish history. Not at all. What I'm saying is, in equality rights terms, that nobody is seeking for Israel and the Jewish people to be above the law, but not to be systematically denied equality before the law. Not that Israel should respect human rights, which we should, but that the rights of Israel deserve equal respect. Not that human rights standards should not be applied to Israel. They must be. But these standards must be applied to everyone else. And so I say the use of the equality rights lens and the human rights lens with respect to both understanding and combating this new anti-Semitism. In conclusion, may I just say that I come to the support of Israel and the Jewish people, not because it is a Jewish cause. That would be not enough for me. I come to the support of Israel and the Jewish people because I believe profoundly, with all its imperfections, that it is a just cause. And if it is a just cause, it deserves the support of all those who care about the pursuit of justice. And similarly, with respect to Zionism, because Zionism, as the expression of the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, of the Jewish people as an indigenous people, equally deserves support for all those who engage in the pursuit of justice, both domestically and internationally. And so when I embrace the cause of Israel and the Jewish people and Zionism, I do so as someone who engages in it and with it as part of the larger struggle for the pursuit of international justice in our time. Thank you.